2 days later, the first crack showed publicly. Derek tried to host an open house for a luxury property in Lincoln Park, one of our flagship listings. He went live on Instagram, flashing that polished broker's smile, talking about our firm's elite portfolio. Except the firm wasn't ours anymore. Midway through his live stream, his assistant texted him, then called, then walked into frame looking pale. The listing had been reassigned, effective immediately. Monroe Carter Realty was undergoing restructuring. All major properties were now managed solely under Carter Holdings. His broker access had been revoked pending review. I watched a replay from my hospital bed. He left it off at first, said it was a clerical error, said lawyers would fix it. But lawyers don't fix ownership. Ownership fixes lawyers. Michelle moved carefully, strategically. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, just enforcing what had always been written. Derek had never actually held equity, only a performance-based compensation agreement, tied to marital status and active partnership. He had just ended both. By Friday, the Tesla was towed from the condo garage. Saturday, the building fob stopped responding. Sunday morning, the condo board delivered a formal notice. The property was solely owned by Carter Holdings LLC as a non-employee, non-spouse occupant. He had 72 hours to vacate. My phone buzzed again. This time, his voice wasn't sharp. It was shaken. Ava, we need to talk. This is insane. No, I replied quietly. This is paperwork. You're doing this because I left. I'm doing this because you did. Another pause. You're in a hospital bed, he said, almost desperate. How are you even managing this? I let that hang between us, because that was the part that truly bothered him. Not the money, not the condo, not the car, the control. He thought weakness meant dependence, that because my legs weren't responding, my mind must be fractured too. But paralysis doesn't erase intelligence, it refines it. That evening, Michelle brought another update. Derek had attempted to access company reserves. Denied. He tried to leverage future commissions. Frozen. He even contacted one of our investors directly. The investor forwarded the email to me with a simple note. We stand with you, Miss Carter. For the first time since the accident, something inside me felt steady. Not anger, not vengeance. Clarity. Derek didn't betray a helpless woman. He underestimated a prepared one. And underestimation is expensive. By the end of the week, he would realize something else. Walking away from me didn't just cost him a marriage. It cost him the illusion that he ever built anything at all. 3 days after Derek stormed out of my hospital room, the silence around him began to fracture. Not publicly, not dramatically, but quietly, the way reputations actually unravel. And Derek had made a fatal mistake. He tried to pitch himself as the visionary founder of our firm during a private lunch with 2 mid-level developers. He claimed I had stepped back long before the accident, claimed the restructuring was just a technical shuffle. Unfortunately for him, one of those developers sat on the advisory board of Carter Holdings. By that evening, Michelle had forwarded me the audio recording. I didn't feel rage listening to it. I felt disappointment. Not because he lied, but because he truly believed he could. The next morning, a formal notice went out from our legal team clarifying executive leadership, ownership distribution, and intellectual property rights. Derek's name was absent from every foundational document. He wasn't a co-founder. He wasn't a majority partner. He wasn't even a minority stakeholder. He had been a salaried executive with performance bonuses. That was it. By noon, his LinkedIn profile changed from co-founder to independent consultant. By PM, the Miami penthouse he'd been temporarily staying in requested immediate payment for the voided reservation. By PM, he called me again. This time, he didn't yell. Ava, he said quietly, you're humiliating me. I shifted slightly in my hospital bed. My physical therapist had just left after helping me stand for 6 seconds with support. 6 seconds felt like a victory. I'm correcting the record, I replied. You didn't have to go this far. You did. He exhaled sharply. We could have handled this privately. We were married privately. You divorced me publicly. Silence. Then softer, almost pleading. I was scared. That word lingered. Scared of what? Of caregiving? Of uncertainty? Of losing the aesthetic of a perfect life? You weren't scared when you asked me to sign, I said evenly. I thought you'd fight me. I don't fight impulsively. That was something Derek never understood about me. I don't explode. I reposition. While he was posting curated freedom online, I was reviewing asset maps from my hospital bed. While he was explaining away revoked access, I was strengthening investor confidence. And something unexpected began to happen. Clients started sending flowers. Board members visited in person. A local business journal requested an interview about resilience in leadership. Derek thought I needed legs to stand. He forgot I already had a foundation. 2 weeks after the divorce filing, Carter Holdings Realty Group closed its largest commercial deal in company history. I signed the contract from my recovery suite. The press release went live at a.m. At 9:07 a.m., Derek texted, "How are you still winning?" I stared at the message for a long time. Then I typed back 4 words. "I never stop building." He responded 10 minutes later. "Agenda, Ava. This isn't a board meeting." To him, it wasn't. To me, everything was. I didn't reply. An hour passed. Then another. Finally, "Fine. I want to discuss a settlement adjustment. And other things." Other things. Translation: he was running out of options. 2 days later, we met in a private conference room at the rehab center. Neutral ground, glass walls, controlled space. He looked different. Still polished, still styled, but thinner around the confidence. Leela was nowhere in sight. "You look strong," he said carefully as I wheeled in. "I am." He sat across from me, sliding a folder forward. "I've been offered a partnership," he began, "but they want clarity on my previous firm's valuation. If you adjust the public filings, make it look more collaborative, it helps both of us." There it was. Not reconciliation. Reputation repair. "You want me to rewrite history," I said. "No, just soften it." I opened the folder. Draft language positioning him as founding visionary. Impressive phrasing. Fictional foundation. "You left me in intensive care," I said evenly. "And now you want branding support?" His jaw tightened. "I made a mistake. You made a decision." Silence pressed between us. "I panicked," he admitted. "I didn't think you'd recover this fast." Recover. As if resilience was an inconvenience to him. "I'm still recovering," I said, "but I don't recover backward." He exhaled sharply. "Leela left." I raised an eyebrow. "She said she didn't sign up for instability." The irony hung thick in the room. "You see the pattern?" I asked quietly. His eyes flickered. For a moment, just a moment, I saw something honest. "Fear. You built everything," he said finally. I just stood in it. That was the closest he'd come to truth. And when the structure shifted, I replied, "You fell." He nodded once, almost imperceptibly. "So that's it?" he asked. "You're just going to let me drown?" I leaned back slightly in my chair. "I'm not responsible for teaching you how to swim." Outside the glass walls, a therapist adjusted equipment for another patient. Inside, Derek realized something irreversible. I wasn't the woman he could outshine anymore. I was the system he never understood. And systems don't bend for nostalgia. When he left that room, he didn't slam the door. He didn't argue. He just walked out quieter than before. And for the first time since he'd asked me to sign those papers, I felt something settle completely. Not vengeance. Not victory. Finality. A month after our meeting, something shifted in the media. Not dramatically. Strategically. Chicago Business Weekly ran a feature titled, "Resilience in Real Estate, Ava Carter's Strategic Comeback." They didn't mention Derek much. Just a brief line about former executive leadership departing during restructuring. That was it. One sentence. Years of his self-proclaimed legacy reduced to a footnote. The article focused on my recovery, my leadership from a hospital suite, the record-breaking commercial close, the rebrand back to Carter Holdings Realty Group. Investors love stability, markets love strength, and the public loves a comeback story. My inbox flooded with partnership inquiries, speaking engagements, podcast requests. Meanwhile, Derek's new partnership opportunity quietly dissolved. Word had spread that his ownership claims were exaggerated. No one wants a liability wrapped in charisma. One evening, as I practiced walking between parallel bars, 8 full steps this time, Michelle called. "You're going to appreciate this," she said. Derek had attempted to launch a boutique consulting firm under the name DC Urban Strategy. The problem? The branding closely resembled a registered subsidiary under Carter Holdings. Intellectual property violation. Unintentional, perhaps. Still actionable. "What do you want to do?" Michelle asked. I paused, steadying myself against the bars. For months I had responded, corrected, enforced. But now the power dynamic was no longer about survival. It was about direction. Send a warning, I said calmly. No lawsuit. Just clarity. Michelle chuckled softly. Mercy? Efficiency. Dragging him through court would cost time. Time was better spent building. The warning letter was delivered the next morning. By afternoon, his website went dark. That night, he called again, but this time, I didn't answer. Not because I was angry, because I was done reacting. Later that week, I stood at a small internal company, gathering a native for nearly 30 seconds, as the board announced a new expansion into Seattle. Applause filled the room. Not forced, not sympathetic, earned. Afterward, one of our senior investors approached me. You handled that situation with remarkable composure, he said carefully. Most people would have burned everything down. I smiled. Fire spreads, I replied. Foundations last. Across the city, Derek was starting over from scratch. No shared condo, no executive title, no curated narrative, just his name. And for the first time, that name stood alone. He thought leaving me would free him. Instead, it revealed him. And revelation is far more powerful than revenge. As I walked slowly, steadily toward the elevator that evening, I realized something unexpected. I didn't want him to fail anymore. I just didn't need him to exist in my story. Because the strongest revenge isn't destruction. It's irrelevance. The first time I walked into the Carter Holdings headquarters without assistance, the room went silent. Not out of pity, out of recognition. 6 months earlier, I'd been signing documents from a hospital bed. Now I was crossing polished marble floors in heels again, slower than before. Yes, but steady. Strength looks different after it's tested. I had changed. Not softer, sharper. The Seattle expansion launched ahead of schedule. 2 new development projects secured. A nonprofit housing initiative established under the Carter Foundation, something I'd wanted to do long before the accident, but never prioritized. Perspective rearranges priorities. The accident took my mobility for a while. The divorce removed illusion permanently. And clarity is expensive but worth every cost. One afternoon, as I reviewed quarterly projections, my assistant hesitated at my office door. Miss Carter, there's someone here asking for 5 minutes. I didn't have to ask who. Derek stepped in wearing a navy suit that didn't fit quite as well as the old ones. He looked composed, practiced, but smaller, not physically, energetically. I won't take long, he said. I gestured to the chair across from me, the same position he'd once occupied with authority in board meetings. He remained standing. I'm relocating, he said. Denver. Fresh start. I nodded. That's good. I wanted to say. He paused, searching. You were never the burden. It wasn't a grand apology, but it was honest. I know, I replied. He studied me carefully, as if trying to reconcile the woman in front of him with the one he left in the ICU. You didn't destroy me, he added quietly. I did that myself. Growth often sounds like accountability. I hope you build something real this time, I said. A faint, rueful smile touched his face. Without standing in someone else's shadow, we held eye contact for a long moment, not romantic, not resentful, just resolved. He turned to leave, then hesitated. You never answered my question, he said. Why didn't you tell me how much control you had? I leaned back slightly in my chair. Because partnership isn't about control, I said calmly. It's about trust. He absorbed that. Then he walked out. No slammed doors, no raised voices, just closure. That evening, as the city lights flickered on beyond my office window, I allowed myself a rare still moment. He left me when I couldn't walk. Now I could, but the real shift wasn't physical. It was internal. I no longer needed to prove anything, not resilience, not power, not worth. He underestimated a woman who built quietly, and when the structure shifted, he mistook stillness for weakness. He never saw the architect, only the view, and by the time he realized the difference, I had already rebuilt the skyline. By the time autumn rolled in, Carter Holdings was unrecognizable from the company Derek thought he had a stake in. The Seattle branch was thriving. Our nonprofit housing initiative had already opened to pilot sites, and I'd brought in a new leadership team that didn't need constant reassurance or social proof. Every morning, I reviewed contracts, investor reports, and project timelines while sipping black coffee. The wrist brace still hugged my arm from my rehabilitation exercises, but my hands were steady. My body was no longer a limitation, it was a reminder. Every scar, every ache, every delayed step was a mark of the planning and persistence that Derek had mocked. He tried contacting me again, once via text, once via email, but I ignored both. Each message reflected a man clinging to status, to influence, to connections he hadn't earned. By this point, the Tesla lease had fully transferred into my name. The condo had been sold to a legitimate buyer, and the boutique firm he had attempted to create in Chicago quietly dissolved. I hadn't needed to push him. I just enforced the system I had built. Then came the call I'd been anticipating. A major investor, one who had initially questioned my ability to lead alone, reached out. "I just want to apologize," he said. "You handled the restructuring flawlessly. Honestly, the clarity and foresight you've shown are rare." I smiled. "Thank you. It's all in the groundwork. You can't panic when someone misunderstands the foundations." Meanwhile, Derek's social media started to shrink. Leela had long since moved on, leaving behind subtle Instagram posts about growth and finding stability. He was forced to admit, in private circles, that he had overestimated his role in what I had truly built. In the evenings, I practiced walking without assistance. Step by step, I reclaimed more of my independence. It wasn't just a body, it was a mental reclaiming. Every step reminded me that I had never been dependent, that my value had never been tied to Derek's perception. The most satisfying part of this rebuilding wasn't seeing Derek's struggle, it was knowing I no longer cared about his life, his success, or his failures. I had moved beyond revenge, beyond proof, beyond needing anyone to recognize my worth. From my new office, looking out over Seattle's skyline, I realized something important. Strength is quiet, methodical, and patient. It doesn't announce itself. It waits, grows, and when the time is right, it leaves no trace of doubt. Derek thought leaving me would diminish me. Instead, it had liberated me, and the woman who rebuilt her life on her own terms. She didn't just survive, she became unstoppable. Winter settled over Seattle, bringing crisp mornings and long shadows. By now, Derek had vanished entirely from my day-to-day life. His name no longer triggered any tension, only faint echoes of a past misjudgment. He was a man chasing mirrors, and I was done reflecting for anyone. My focus had shifted entirely to expansion. Carter Holdings had acquired a small portfolio of industrial properties, investments that Derek had once dismissed as boring. Now, they were generating consistent cash flow, quietly strengthening the company's position. I oversaw the acquisitions remotely while continuing my physical therapy. Each step I took in the gym, each incremental increase in mobility, mirrored the incremental growth of my empire. Then came a curious moment. An email from Derek's accountant. He had attempted to move the last joint funds tied to our prior agreements. The accounts were frozen, and the funds had already been legally reassigned under Carter Holdings. The message was polite, almost pleading. "Miss Carter, I'm reaching out on behalf of Mr. Carter to resolve the situation." I forwarded the email to Michelle. Her response was brisk. "No negotiation, no exceptions." Later that week, I attended a charity gala I had quietly organized, honoring women in business. The event was flawless. Media coverage highlighted not only my company's success, but also the resilience and leadership that had carried me through months of personal and professional upheaval. Derek's absence was noted by those in attendance who had known him, though subtly. No one mentioned him directly. It was as if he had faded into irrelevance. That evening, a junior executive approached me, eyes wide. "Miss Carter, the board has noticed Derek's former investors reaching out. They're asking about leadership continuity and risk management. They want reassurance from you personally." I nodded calmly. "Then provide reassurance. Show them the structures we've implemented. Show them we're untouchable." It was a stark contrast to the man he had been. Panic-driven, reactive, desperate to reclaim something he never fully owned. Back in my apartment, I removed my wrist brace entirely and flexed my hands. My body had regained strength, Yes, but the real victory was mental. Derek had underestimated me because he saw only what he thought was weakness. I had turned that misjudgment into a silent arsenal. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to lean back in the chair without thinking about him, without reviewing contracts or checking on property files. My phone remained silent. My empire remained intact. And I realized something profound. The quietest victories are often the most powerful, because the person you defeat never fully understands the loss. Derek had walked away thinking he left a burden. I had proven that I was far more than anyone had ever seen. And now, finally, I could focus entirely on myself. Not revenge, not proof, just unstoppable forward momentum. By early spring, Carter Holdings had grown beyond the boundaries of what Derek thought possible. The Seattle office now managed commercial, residential, and industrial investments, and our nonprofit initiatives were receiving national recognition. I traveled occasionally for high-profile meetings, but the routine of oversight and strategy became almost meditative, like walking a tightrope I had built myself. Derek tried again, though more subtly this time. An anonymous tip arrived at the office claiming irregularities in past acquisitions he had once managed. My assistant handed me the envelope while I reviewed quarterly projections. I opened it calmly. The documents were messy, incomplete, and frankly, inconsequential. Someone had obviously done this in haste, probably him. I smiled. The noise didn't matter. The system I had built was airtight. Michelle advised sending a neutral confirmation, all audits in order, no further questions. I approved. Meanwhile, Derek's online presence had dwindled to sporadic LinkedIn updates, each one carefully curated to mask his lack of progress. He tried to network, to make himself relevant, but investors and former partners quickly realized that without access, his leverage was gone. One evening, as I returned from a board dinner, I looked out over the Seattle skyline from my new penthouse. Lights sparkled below like reminders of every project, every negotiation, every calculated step I had taken since the hospital bed. Derek had walked away thinking he was gaining freedom. I had gained everything he ever assumed I depended on him for. That night, my phone buzzed. A simple text from an unknown number. "You're remarkable. I don't know how you did it." I chuckled quietly. No signature, no context. Just an acknowledgement that the world outside my empire noticed what Derek never could. I had been building silently, patiently, and methodically. I thought about him then not with bitterness, but with clarity. He had underestimated invisible power. He believed only visible strength mattered. But real influence doesn't shout. It doesn't flaunt. It grows quietly, while the arrogant walk past it. I set the phone down, turned off the lights, and stretched my legs in my newly rebuilt body. Every scar, every ache, every moment of vulnerability had been accounted for and transformed into strategy. Tomorrow would bring more meetings, more investments, more expansions. Derek would remain a shadow in the past, a cautionary tale for those who confuse surface charm with substance. And I would continue building. Silently, relentlessly, untouchable. Because some victories aren't loud. They're the kind that leave someone looking back, finally aware that they never really understood who they were up against. The woman in the mirror no longer needed validation. She had survived, adapted, and mastered the game entirely on her own terms. Derek never saw it coming, and that was the point. Spring had fully arrived, and with it, a clarity I hadn't felt since before the accident. Carter Holdings was no longer just surviving, it was thriving. The Seattle branches, expansion into tech-driven property management had attracted new investors from the West Coast, and the nonprofit housing initiative was being considered for a federal grant. My vision, once sidelined in a hospital bed, had now come to life with a precision and scale Derek never imagined. Derek tried reaching out again, this time indirectly. He contacted mutual acquaintances, old investors, even a few of our former clients, attempting to cast doubt on my leadership during my recovery. Each attempt was met with quiet professionalism. My systems were airtight. My board had been briefed. Every move had been anticipated. A casual Friday afternoon brought the next reminder of his desperation. A former colleague texted me. "Derek asked if you'd agree to a joint interview for a local business magazine. Says he wants to clear the air." I smiled and handed the phone to Michelle. "No, I said. He doesn't get a platform to rewrite history. Michelle nodded. I've blocked all further requests. The message is received. The woman who built this doesn't negotiate with the man who left her in a hospital bed. That evening, I reviewed the week's financials. Everything was in order. Every transfer, every acquisition, every subsidiary was aligned perfectly. Derek had no leverage left. He had no control. Not a single document bore his signature. The illusion of influence he had clung to was gone, invisible but irrefutably absent. Then, a knock at the office door. One of my senior investors stepped in, eyes serious. Ava, I have to ask, how did you do this? Recover from that accident, handle the divorce, and expand the company simultaneously? I leaned back in my chair. I never saw it as recovery or revenge. I saw it as building. Every setback is a blueprint. Every assumption others make about you is a tool. You just have to know how to use it. He shook his head slowly, impressed. Most people would crumble under half of that pressure. You turned it into dominance. It wasn't dominance. It was strategy, patience, methodical planning. Derek had always thought visibility was power. I had learned that quiet control underestimated. Invisible, relentless is what really changes outcomes. That night, as the city lights reflected off the glass of my office, my phone remained silent. No texts, no calls from Derek. And that silence wasn't emptiness, it was acknowledgement. The acknowledgement that the woman he left behind had never needed him, never depended on him, and had, in fact, left him irrelevant. Finally, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction, not gloating, not celebration, but calm awareness. He had underestimated me, and I had outlasted him completely. The echo of his choices would follow him forever. I, however, was moving forward. By summer, Carter Holdings' presence in Seattle was more than a statement. It was undeniable proof that I had built something lasting. Every property, every contract, every subsidiary now bore my oversight. I walked through the offices with steady confidence, employees greeting me warmly, investors respecting my decisions, and boards trusting my judgment. Each day was a reminder that I had not just recovered from my accident, I had expanded my influence far beyond what Derek ever imagined. Meanwhile, Derek's attempts to regain relevance had become almost desperate. Rumors reached me that he had tried to pitch a boutique consulting service in Denver, claiming expertise in strategic real estate transitions. Investors who once followed him politely declined. The same people he had leaned on for credibility now quietly reminded him of facts he'd failed to consider. He had no legal claim, no equity, no documented authority. I heard about it from Michelle, who sent me a concise report with a small, almost amused note. He's learning what it means to be powerless. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Power doesn't always require a reaction, it requires consistency. One evening, while reviewing quarterly expansion reports in my penthouse overlooking the city, that week, Carter Holdings finalized another acquisition, 3 mid-sized commercial properties in the downtown district. Derek had once walked those same streets, claiming insight and influence. Now, his name didn't appear anywhere in public records. Not a whisper, not a trace. I realized something crucial. Derek had never truly understood influence. He mistook charm for authority, attention for control. I had learned early on that the unseen frameworks are what sustain power: the contracts, the trust agreements, the legal structures, the quiet attention to detail. And I had applied that knowledge meticulously while he assumed my silence meant weakness. As I closed the quarterly reports, my legs aching pleasantly from a long session with my physical therapist, I understood the final lesson of the ordeal. Revenge isn't loud. It isn't flashy. It's silent, unrelenting, and methodical. Derek had walked away thinking he left a fragile woman behind. In reality, he left behind someone who had built an empire quietly while he focused on appearances. That night, I allowed myself a rare smile. I didn't need to see Derek falter to know I had won. The empire he could not touch stood firmly, a testament to patience, intelligence, and relentless foresight. And in that quiet victory, I finally understood the power of being underestimated. Because when the world assumes you are weak, every calculated step you take becomes unstoppable. I was no longer the woman he left in a hospital bed. I was the architect of everything he thought he owned, and nothing he could do would ever change that. By late summer, the Seattle branch of Carter Holdings had become the gold standard of strategic growth. Investors were impressed, clients were loyal, and employees felt secure under leadership that combined vision with precision. I spent mornings reviewing acquisitions, afternoons in boardroom meetings, and evenings in therapy sessions, strengthening my body as steadily as I strengthened my company. One Wednesday, Michelle approached me with a letter in hand. "It came for you personally," she said, handing it over. The envelope was thick, embossed with the logo of the boutique law firm Derek had once bragged about using for our divorce. I opened it slowly. Inside was a cease and desist. Derek was attempting to use the Carter Holdings name for a new venture, claiming trademark infringement. I leaned back in my chair and let out a quiet laugh. "He's still trying," I said. "He doesn't understand the law or me." Michelle smirked. "Do you want me to handle this quietly or make a statement?" "Quietly," I replied. He had no recourse. Every contract, every property, every document had been meticulously structured under my name alone. His attempts to leverage influence or association now fell flat because I had foreseen every possibility. Later that afternoon, I walked into the boardroom for a routine quarterly meeting. The team was assembled, charts and projections displayed across the digital screens. I began reviewing updates when one of the senior managers spoke up. "Miss Carter," she said carefully, "I think it's time to update the investor report regarding leadership and ownership. Some of them have asked about former partners." I nodded, calm but firm. "Include a clear statement. All equity, all holdings, and all decision-making. Authority rests solely with Carter Holdings, LLC. Nothing else exists outside of that. Nothing Derek says changes this." A few heads nodded, impressed with the clarity and authority of the declaration. Later that evening, I returned to my penthouse. The city lights reflected against the glass walls like a quiet celebration of everything I had built. My phone buzzed once, another message from an old colleague. Just 3 words. "You're untouchable, Ava." I smiled. Untouchable wasn't arrogance, it was consequence. Derek had assumed weakness when he saw vulnerability. But weakness is a perception. Strength is silent. As I settled into my evening routine, stretching and reviewing notes for the next day's board meeting, I realized something profound. Power isn't in being loud. It's in building while others underestimate you, in waiting while others act impulsively, and in standing when others assume you're broken. Derek had left, believing he had gained freedom. I had stayed, rebuilt, and now commanded the world he thought was his. And the irony? He never even saw me coming. I was no longer a woman in a hospital bed. I was the architect of an empire he never touched. And the reminder of that truth would outlast him forever. Autumn deepened, and with it, a sense of closure settled over my life. Carter Holdings was expanding faster than anyone had projected. Our nonprofit initiative was now being recognized by national housing authorities. I had begun mentoring young women entering the real estate and finance industries, teaching them lessons Derek never learned, that patience, foresight, and preparation are more valuable than charm or bravado. One crisp Friday morning, Michelle brought in a package. "From Chicago," she said. I recognized the logo immediately, the boutique law firm Derek had once used for our divorce. Inside, a single sheet of paper rested, a formal acknowledgement that Derek had no claims to any Carter Holdings assets, subsidiaries, or intellectual property. The letter concluded with an almost apologetic tone, clearly drafted by someone aware that his attempts had been futile. I set it aside without reading further. Derek had finally accepted what I already knew. He had been replaced by the system he never understood. That evening, I hosted a small gathering for the new leadership team. The room buzzed with energy, ideas, and strategy. No one mentioned Derek. He had become irrelevant. For him, the world had moved on, or rather, I had moved him out of it entirely without a single dramatic confrontation. Later, as I walked along the Seattle waterfront, I reflected on the arc of the past year. Derek had underestimated me from the very beginning. He saw my injury, my temporary vulnerability, and assumed it defined me. But weakness is never permanent when combined with strategy. Patience, methodical planning, and quiet resilience can turn even the most dire circumstances into platforms for unprecedented success. I paused and looked out at the reflection of the city in the water. It was serene, unstoppable, unshakable. That reflection mirrored not just my physical recovery, but the entirety of the empire I had built while the world assumed I was broken. The final lesson was clear. People rarely see what's being built quietly. They underestimate until it's irreversible. Derek had assumed freedom when he left, but in reality, he had forfeited control, respect, and relevance. Meanwhile, I had learned that true power doesn't announce itself, it asserts quietly, patiently, and absolutely. That night, I returned to my office to review plans for the next quarter. Investors, employees, and clients all trusted my judgment implicitly. Derek was no longer a factor. He was a memory, a cautionary tale of arrogance and misjudgment. As I signed off the day's reports, I realized I had reached something far beyond revenge or proof. I had reached autonomy, real influence, a life rebuilt on my terms, with no one else's validation required. And that, I thought, is a power that even someone like Derek could never touch. I leaned back, finally at peace, knowing the empire I built wasn't just untouchable, it was mine entirely. Unseen, silent, complete. Winter turned to early spring, and the Seattle skyline gleamed under a soft sunrise as I entered the Carter Holdings headquarters for the first board meeting of the year. I no longer needed crutches or braces. My steps were steady, confident, an outward reflection of the internal authority I had cultivated. The company thrived, the nonprofit initiatives expanded, and every decision, every contract, every acquisition had been executed with precision. Derek had been entirely erased from the equation, irrelevant, powerless, and ultimately forgotten. Michelle handed me a folder before the meeting. Inside were updates from investors. Every major shareholder had reaffirmed their confidence in my leadership. Not a single dissenting voice, not one question of my decisions during my recovery. Everything had been anticipated and managed flawlessly. As the board meeting began, I presented the quarterly growth report. The numbers were strong. The new properties, the tech-driven management systems, the nonprofit expansions all exceeded projections. I paused, letting the room absorb the significance. This was more than profit, it was proof that meticulous planning and patience yield results stronger than any ego-driven effort. After the meeting, I retreated to my office. My phone buzzed, a message from a former colleague in Chicago. Derek asked if you'll ever speak to him again. He says he needs advice. I didn't respond. Later that evening, I walked across the office balcony overlooking the city. The reflection of lights danced on the glass, a mirror of the empire I had built. Derek had assumed leaving me meant freedom. In reality, he had freed me to reclaim every piece of what was rightfully mine. Every contract, every property, every investment, all carefully structured under my oversight, remained untouched. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't power flaunted. It was a demonstration of inevitability. People like Derek believe presence equates to influence. They never realize the quiet, patient, methodical work happening behind the scenes is what actually matters. I thought about the journey, the accident, the divorce, the years of careful planning no one saw. He had left thinking he discarded a burden. Instead, he revealed his own limitations, and I had used them to rebuild, to expand, to create a legacy completely on my own terms. I sat in my office, hands on the desk, reviewing plans for new acquisitions and partnerships. The city hummed below, vibrant and alive, and I realized the most satisfying victory wasn't what he lost, it was that I no longer needed him, validation, or recognition. I was unstoppable, and so the final truth settled quietly in my mind. The woman he thought he left broken had built an empire, walked into it herself, and left him forever irrelevant. Because some people don't need to yell, to fight, or to prove anything. They just build, and when the time comes, they rise silent, unshakable, untouchable. Months passed, and the rhythm of my life settled into something steady, deliberate, and undeniable. Carter Holdings continued to flourish. Seattle projects expanded. Nonprofit housing initiatives grew, and investor confidence hit an all-time high. Every morning, I reviewed financials and strategies. Every afternoon, I oversaw acquisitions and team meetings. Every evening, I committed to therapy sessions that strengthened my body as much as my mind. Derek's presence or lack thereof had become irrelevant. Occasionally, news of his attempts to start a consulting firm or pitch small investments reached me through mutual contacts. Each time, I acknowledged it briefly, then returned to my work. He was a ghost, attempting to make noise in a world I had already structured to be silent, controlled, and immovable. One afternoon, Michelle handed me a folder marked Investor Concerns. I glanced inside and smiled. Derek had apparently contacted a few minority shareholders, trying to cast doubt on my leadership during my recovery. But the documents I had prepared, the clear contracts, ownership records, and legal structures spoke for themselves. There was no ambiguity, no space for challenge. That should settle it, I said, sliding the folder back to Michelle. She grinned. It's like he keeps digging a hole he can't climb out of. Let him, I replied. Silence is more powerful than confrontation. Later, as I walked along the rooftop terrace of our Seattle headquarters, the city lights flickering below, I realized the truth Derek never understood. Strength doesn't need validation. Influence doesn't need visibility. Power doesn't need drama. While he chased mirrors and performed for applause, I had been quietly building foundations that no one could touch, no one could dismantle, and no one could falsely claim. I thought back to the hospital room, to the moment he demanded I sign the divorce papers. He thought he was discarding a burden. In reality, he had discarded his understanding of who I truly was: the architect, the strategist, the silent force behind everything he assumed he had. And now, fully recovered and fully in control, I knew something vital. Revenge isn't about watching someone fall. It's about building so thoroughly that they become irrelevant without you ever lifting a finger to stop them. I took a deep breath, letting the cold Seattle air fill my lungs. Every property, every contract, every decision now reflected my authority. Derek had walked away thinking he had escaped. In truth, he had freed me to ascend entirely on my terms. And in that quiet power, the kind that requires no announcement, no spectacle, no validation, I finally understood the ultimate victory: being untouchable, unassailable, and entirely oneself. The woman he underestimated had risen, silent and unstoppable, leaving him nothing but echoes of a past he could never reclaim. By the time summer fully arrived, everything had settled into a rhythm that was as unstoppable as it was deliberate. Carter Holdings had grown beyond Seattle: new acquisitions, expanded nonprofit initiatives, tech-driven property management systems. Every contract, every subsidiary, every dollar flowed exactly where it belonged. And for the first time, I felt a profound clarity. This life, this empire, was mine entirely. No one could touch it. No one could question it. And certainly no one could take it from me. Derek called one last time. His voice was cautious, stripped of its old arrogance. Ava, I want to understand how you did all this. I leaned back in my chair, watching the city lights dance across the glass walls of my office. Calmly, I said, you never asked when it mattered, and I never explained myself to people who only see the surface. There was a pause. I could hear his swallowed frustration, the weight of recognition sinking in. He had finally realized the truth. He had walked away thinking he left a broken woman behind, but in reality, he had walked away from someone building an empire while he focused on appearances. You're untouchable, he admitted quietly. Not untouchable, I corrected. Methodical. Invisible until the moment the world has no choice but to recognize it. That silence was final. No argument, no pleading, no excuses. He had nothing left to claim. I hung up the phone and turned to the city beyond. The skyline glimmered with opportunity, achievement, and freedom, the very things he had assumed he could strip away, yet had only made stronger through absence. For months, I had walked from hospital bed to boardroom, from weakness to strength, from obscurity to undeniable authority. And the lesson was clear. Power isn't about confrontation. It isn't about spectacle. It isn't about revenge. True power is built quietly, patiently, and relentlessly. It exists long after the noise fades and the people who doubted you are gone. That night, I finally allowed myself to sit in the quiet, unshakable peace of knowing I had risen completely on my own terms. The empire, the nonprofit, the legacy, every piece of it was mine. Derek had underestimated me at every turn, and now he was nothing but a shadow in the story I had authored. I walked through the office one last time before leaving for the evening, feeling the solidity of every wall, every floor, every decision. This life, this empire was untouchable, not because I had to prove it, but because I had built it silently, steadily, and perfectly. And the woman he thought he left broken? She wasn't just whole, she was unstoppable. The story ended not with vengeance, not with spectacle, but with quiet, absolute, undeniable triumph. Ava Carter had risen, and nothing, not him, not circumstance, not anyone could ever undo it.